We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsom, and we arrive at a stacked pay-per-view event which will go down in the T-Mobile Arena in Vegas. We have two title fights. The tough 29 coaches collide for the UFC Featherweight Championship as Alexander Volkanovski fights Brian T. City Ortega. Two dominant fighters with only two professional losses between them. Then we move on to our second title fight with the UFC Women's Flyweight Championship as one of the best fighters we've ever seen in mixed martial arts. Valentina Shevchenko fights Lauren Murphy, and I've got some pretty controversial thoughts regarding that fight too. We also have the return of Nick Diaz, who'll be fighting for the first time in almost 6 years as he gets to fight another fan favourite veteran in Robbie Lawler. I cannot wait for Saturday night. But just before we get into breaking down the fights at UFC 266, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365. The last event was a mixed event. We dropped a bet on Impa Kasanganay, which was unfortunate how that fight ended. Nothing against Carlston Harris and nothing against the finish, but I'd have just loved to have seen that fight play out longer. We also dropped a bet on Tony Gravely, which is the one that's really hard to swallow considering he borderline had Manus knocked out at the end of round one, saved by the bell. Credit to Manus coming back to land a shot that knocked Gravely out, but it was a really bad beats bet. The money back guarantee dog of the week was Gustavo Lopez, so that was a draw and a push. And as for the fun gamblers section, the 4-leg parlay was a winner, and 8 out of the 14 parlay piece options won too. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the UFC betting advice and DraftKings FanDuel advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event for the UFC Featherweight Championship. The tough 29 coaches, we've got Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega. Volkanovski is currently the minus 167 favourite. The comeback on Ortega as the plus 147 underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the favourite and the champion in Volkanovski. I think there is an argument that he could potentially be a bigger favourite in this fight, but I think the reason why the lines are close is just because of how Ortega looked last time, which we'll talk about very soon, and the fact that Ortega is seriously dangerous. But I do think that at minus 167, that's the better bet than the plus 147 of Brian Ortega. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I almost get the feeling that the Volkanovski betting line is trying to get wide, but every time it hits sort of minus 180, minus 185, there's a ton of money coming back in on Ortega, and it's settling at roughly where it is now. Now, I actually think the closer we get to fight night, so say Friday night into the Saturday day, I do think we're going to see a lot of money coming in on Ortega, and I think it's actually going to shorten the lineup quite a bit. I don't think it's going to go crazy, going to go nuts, but I do think Volkanovski is going to close it around the minus 150 line, with Ortega potentially being around plus 125, plus 130. Now, as for how this fight plays out, we've got to talk about Ortega, people calling him Ortega 2.0, which was pretty fair after the performance that he put in against the Korean Zombie last time out. He did look like a totally different fighter in regards to he was fighting an opponent who was supposed to have been the better striker, yet Ortega looked like the better striker, and he didn't need his grappling or a submission to win the fight either. So from that perspective, Ortega looked completely different. Now, when I was watching the fight live as it was happening, I was super impressed with Ortega. I actually called it one of the most developed fighters that we've ever seen in the UFC, but I actually think I was exaggerating or over-exaggerating just because I was in the moment in that time. After I've watched this fight back, I wasn't as impressed with Ortega as what I was first time around. I think it was just, like I say, you're just being in the moment and everything just looking super improved, super developed. But what I found with Ortega watching the fight back is I found that his punches were one shot at a time. They were more reactive punches as Korean Zombie was plodding into range. Ortega was able to land a single strike on him. There wasn't too many extended combinations. I don't think his speed in regards to his strikes and his movement had improved. The one thing in regards to a development that spans off from the movement side is he was switching stances really well. But overall, although he did look like a better striker in that fight for sure, I just don't think he was the phenom that I thought and other people thought whilst watching it live. Now, when you get to Volkanovski is only going to be a couple of inches shorter in this fight. It's not like it's going to be a Max Holloway difference. Volkanovski does have speed in his strikes and his movement. He throws in combinations. He throws a ton of volume. He mixes things up between low kicks and then moving into range and landing combinations to the head and to the body of his opponents as well. And this is where I think that Ortega's going to get stuck a little bit, because Volkanovski slides in and out of range really well, really quickly, landing strikes, getting out of the range, getting out of danger, exiting, angling, and then coming back in again. Whereas what Korean Zombie did against Ortega is Zombie was plodding into that range and it allowed Ortega to land reactive shots as Korean Zombie was coming in. It's not going to be as easy for Ortega to land those shots on Volkanovski just because of how much quicker he is and how elusive he is with his movement. Also, Volkanovski is really smart as well, so he'll pick and choose his times. The one thing, though, that you will have to be concerned about if you are on the Volkanovski side is that Ortega does still pack power. And we saw that against the Korean Zombie. From that first knockdown, the Korean Zombie said he didn't remember anything from the fight at that point. He just blanked out and he was just fighting on instinct. And that does speak volumes of the power that Ortega has. We saw Volkanovski dropped against Max Holloway with an uppercut. The uppercut is a punch that Ortega likes. So from that perspective, Volkanovski's got to be really careful. He also has to be really careful, Volkanovski, of using his wrestling in this fight as well. Now, luckily for Volkanovski, he's not one of those fighters that has to use his wrestling, that relies on the wrestling to win his fights. He can strike his way to win fights via decision or, dropping his opponents and hurting them therefore afterwards. But with the wrestling, Volkanovski's got to be super careful. I don't think he can relentlessly wrestle here, because I do think Ortega is an absolute beast. He's an elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter and he's smart on the mat and with his submissions as well. So if Volkanovski is shooting in, he runs the risk of Ortega jumping onto a neck, latching onto a neck, hopping the back and potentially getting Volkanovski out of there. So the two concerns is Volkanovski not overly wrestling, but like I said, Volkanovski's fight IQ is off the charts. So I'd be surprised if Volkanovski really did have a wrestling game plan here. I think he knows that he's the faster fighter with more volume, that he can just be in and out and just tag Ortega up for 25 minutes if he needs to, just avoid the big shots from Ortega that's going to drop him and cause problems. So I think the fight IQ is something that definitely goes in the favour of Volkanovski, because he's likely going to keep himself out of these or giving Ortega these submission opportunities. And then it just leaves the fact of Ortega probably has a puncher's chance on the feet. So that's why I think that Volkanovski is favoured in this fight. I do think even though he was coming off a controversial decision against Max Holloway, Ortega is probably going to be an easier opponent than what Holloway was. So I think Volkanovski is going to score volume here. I think he's going to throw in combinations. I think he's going to be in and out of range. I think he's going to frustrate Ortega. Ortega's going to have his moments. I think Ortega's definitely the fighter that's more likely to finish. I just don't think that finish comes. I'm picking Alexander Volkanovski and still the UFC Featherweight champion. And in the next fight, in the co-main event for the Women's Flyweight Championship, we've got Valentina Bullet Shevchenko versus Lauren Lucky Murphy. Shevchenko is currently the minus 1375 favourite, the biggest favourite on the card, with the comeback on Murphy at plus 900. As for where the value is on the money line, there's no value on the money line. The betting line is way too wide to be playing the favourite. And although I understand why the betting line's this wide, obviously, this is mixed martial arts. If Shevchenko rolls her ankle, breaks her ankle, or, cannot continue for an injury or something like that, still at minus 1375, the betting line's too wide. But on the flip side, with Lauren Murphy, there's no value at plus 900 either, because ultimately the chances are that's going to be a losing betting ticket. If you do really want action on this fight, there's other ways to play it. Look at props, look at method of victory and things like that, but from the money line perspective, there's no value. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think the betting line's going to rise. It is actually minus 1500 in some spots as well. I do think it's going to close around that minus 1500, minus 1600. In fact, I'm just looking now at minus 1700 at one book. So this could even end up going up to minus 2000. and I wouldn't be surprised if I'm being honest. I don't see many bets coming back on Lauren Murphy. I don't see the line shifting and closing and shortening in that respect. I think it's only going to get wider. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I said at the start in the introduction that I've got some pretty controversial thoughts regarding this fight, and they are surrounding Lauren Murphy. So, from a perspective that Lauren Murphy's got a title shot, something that not many people in the world will ever have or fighters, MMA fighters in the world will ever have the opportunity of fighting for a UFC championship. I am happy for her, but she just hasn't earned or deserved this win, in my opinion. Don't let the 5-fight winning streak fool you, because there's 3 fights in there that I've got big problems with. The first one that I'll talk about is the Shakirova fight, who came in to the UFC, Shakirova did. I think she may have come and gone, if I'm being honest. She didn't look great. She was undersized. It was just a simple, easy fight for Murphy, a mismatch, and one that shouldn't be in the run of a fighter that's about to get a title shot, in my opinion. The other 2 fights in those 3 that I've got problems with, the first one, Andrea Lee, that fight was a downright robbery. And listen, I don't use the word robbery often. I'm normally much calmer, much more composed when it comes to that sort of thing, and I will be able to see the other side and kind of get why it was a close fight and understand that it could have gone either way. But that Andrea Lee fight was a robbery. Andrea Lee won that fight. Lauren Murphy didn't win that fight. I've got no idea what the judges were seeing and how they managed to score that fight for Murphy. So that was a really terrible decision. That should have been a loss on Murphy's record. And then the third and final fight that I've got a big problem with is the Joanne Calderwood fight, for similar reasons as the Andrea Lee and Murphy fight. Murphy didn't win that fight. Now, I do think it was a little bit closer than the Andrea Lee and the Murphy fight, so I am a little bit hesitant, or a little bit more hesitant, to use the word robbery in this fight. But straight up, Joanne Calderwood won that fight. You look at the strikes difference. The fight was won and lost on the feet. Joanne Calderwood landed 123 strikes. Lauren Murphy landed 80. So again, how the judges are seeing that fight for Lauren Murphy is just beyond me. I think that's another loss on Lauren Murphy's record. So even though she's on a 5-fight win streak, I actually think out of those fights, she should have lost 2 of them. And at that point, she doesn't get the title shot. So that's why I don't think it's deserved. But one fighter that isn't going to make this fight close, that isn't going to allow the judges to try and rob her, is Valentina Shevchenko. I think it's going to be an absolute whitewash of a fight. I think Shevchenko is absolutely, clearly levels and levels and levels above Lauren Murphy. She doesn't have any sort of real path to victory. She doesn't have a particular win condition. Obviously, there's always the puncher's chance, which is there in every single mixed martial arts fight. If Murphy did happen to just land a super hard punch on Shevchenko's chin that knocked her out, you know, that's the puncher's chance. 4-ounce gloves. There's always that chance, but it's not a serious path to victory, and it's not a particular win condition. The other thing that could potentially happen is Shevchenko, as I've already said previously, rolling her ankle, breaking a leg, you know, losing the fight that way. Outside of that, Shevchenko is quicker, she's faster, she's stronger, she's the better striker from a technical perspective, she's the better mover, she can fight out in both stances, she's the better wrestler, she's the better grappler, both offensively and defensively from the wrestling and grappling perspective as well. So I think Lauren Murphy is just outgunned everywhere. The only area where this fight is maybe a little bit closer than what some might think is potentially in the strength department, I still think Valentina Shevchenko is deceptively strong, but Lauren Murphy's quite big for the division, so maybe she's a little bit stronger than Shevchenko, but ultimately that's not going to get her a win in this fight. I don't see any other outcome than a Shevchenko win. Shevchenko's the more likely fighter to finish the fight on the feet or on the ground with strikes or a submission. She's also the more likely fighter to win a decision just by sheer volume and numbers over 25 minutes. I'm picking Valentina Shevchenko to win this fight and still the UFC Women's Flyweight champion. And in the next fight, we've got a battle between 2 veterans, 2 fan favourite fighters, 2 fighters that have had knockout power over the years. A returning fighter from 6 years of being on the sidelines. We've got Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz. Lawler is currently the -120 favourite. The comeback on Diaz at +100 as the slight underdog. As for where the value is on the money line, I actually think, even though he's been out for 6 years, at +100, getting plus money on Nick Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler at this stage in his career is the value side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think we're going to see fluctuation here. We have already. Nick Diaz was up at -110 as a picker, -120 as a slight favourite himself. Money's come back in on Lawler. It's flipped the line. So I do think we are going to see these fluctuations throughout fight week. I think when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, it wouldn't shock me if it was a straight -110 pick'em on either side. Now, as for how this fight plays out, firstly, it's going to be a different fight in regards to how both fighters look than the first fight back in 2004 when both fighters were entering the prime and were absolute beasts. Now both fighters are at the end of their career, so things are going to be a little bit different. I do still think Robbie Lawler's going to hold a power advantage in this fight though. Lawler's on a 4-fight losing streak. He's definitely the fighter that we know is looking more declined from fight to fight. We're not sure with Nick Diaz just because we haven't seen him in 6 years, but from Lawler's perspective, he hasn't won in his last 4. And in all fairness to Lawler, actually, when you look at those 4 fights, you can make an argument for why he lost each one, a legit argument. So with the RDA fight, he busted his knee early in that fight, so he was rendered for 5 rounds, fighting on just one leg. Ben Askren is a beast wrestler. So again, that's something that Lawler is going to always have trouble with as a raw power striker. Colby Covington, an even better wrestler. So again, you can understand why Colby Covington won that fight as well. And a cardio machine at that. And then Neil Magny. Neil Magny took him down 4 times. He's a long, tall striker, fighting well at range, but again, can get inside and can wrestle as well. So stylistically, apart from the Dos Anjos fight, Lawler was in bad stylistic fights in 3 of the 4 fights. And like I say, the RDA fight, he blew his knee out. So, you know, the chances of him winning that fight were significantly reduced. But the question I have is, and the thing is, are we going to be making another reason of why Robbie Lawler's lost another fight after this fight with Nick Diaz? Now, I don't think he's stylistically in a bad fight, but I do think that on a 4-fight skid, he is looking less and less interested, in my opinion, when he's in the cage against Neil Magny. He was doing so many things wrong. He wasn't letting his hands go. He wasn't firing. He wasn't being overly aggressive. I actually think that Robbie Lawler would have had a really good chance of winning that fight if he just got in there and he looked hungry and he looked like he wanted to take Magny's head off and he just imposed his will, but he just didn't. And he is worrying signs for a fighter that's 39 years old that is on a 4-fight skid after having a very, very long and successful career. Now, with Nick Diaz, like I say, there's a lot of red flags and question marks here. What's he going to look like? Is he going to look better? He looks in good shape on, you know, his pictures that he's posted on social media. He definitely looks like he's been training hard for this fight, and you've got to assume that he's motivated as well. Otherwise, why would you come back after 6 years of being out the sport? With that being said, like I said, even though there are some question marks on Nick Diaz, I think from a technical perspective, going from the Nick Diaz we've known over the years, I don't think he's going to hold as much power as Lawler, but from a technical perspective, I think he's going to be the more technical fighter. I think Lawler's going to be the one that's throwing more bombs. I think it's a fight that's going to be won and lost on the feet. I'd be really surprised if there was wrestling and grappling in this fight to the extent that the fight was, well, that it actually played a key factor in the fight is what I'm trying to say. So I do think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think that with what we've seen from Lawler, sort of maybe looking a little declined and not looking as hungry to knock his opponent inside the cage, that it's going to allow Nick Diaz just pick him apart and just out volume him over 3 rounds. It wouldn't shock me if Lawler knocked Nick Diaz out if he did turn up hungry, but I'm just going from what I'm seeing from Lawler over his last couple of fights, and I just feel that Nick Diaz might fight this quite smart and just pick away with his technical boxing and ultimately just out volume Robbie Lawler over 3 rounds. So for those reasons, I'm picking Nick Diaz to win this fight. And in the next fight in the UFC heavyweight division, we've got Curtis Razor Blaydes versus Jairzinho Biggie Boy Rozenstruik. Blaydes is currently the -310 favourite. The comeback on Rozenstruik at +255 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think the betting line's quite accurate where it is, if I'm being honest. If you are going to push me for a value side, I would say that the -310 on Curtis Blaydes is still the better bet than the +255 of Rozenstruik. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to fluctuate quite obviously here. I think that we're going to see Curtis Blaydes go up to -330, -340, maybe even -350, but I think it's going to hit a brick wall at around that sort of price. I think it's going to shorten from that point. I think we will see Rozenstruik bets coming in, and I think it's going to close roughly where it's sitting right about now, with Curtis Blaydes at around -300, with Jairzinho Rozenstruik at around the +250 mark. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's actually quite interesting because I was looking back at my notes from Rozenstruik's last fight against Sakai, and one thing that I broke down in that fight on the MMA Play 365 website was the fact that Rozenstruik is a powerful fighter, but as soon as he starts hitting the top of the division, fighting some of the better fighters in the division, he's going to come unstuck in regards to his wrestling. And I actually wrote down the words, if he fights Curtis Blaydes, then he's going to have big problems in that fight. And then a few months down the line, Curtis Blaydes and Rozenstruik gets made. So that's ultimately where I'm at in this fight, because I know that Derek Lewis just knocked Curtis Blaydes out, and could that be a repeat in this fight with Rozenstruik? I think it could for sure. You know, we're in the heavyweight division, and Rozenstruik is in and around those fighters that do hit really hard, like your Derek Lewis, like your Francis Ngannou. Now, I don't think Rozenstruik hits as hard as either of the two fighters that I've just mentioned, but he still does have that touch of death where he can hit you on the chin and knock you out. So that's something that Curtis Blaydes has definitely got to be careful of in this fight. It's one of those heavyweight divisions puncher's chances that are just elevated massively because they're really big guys that hit really hard. But from a stylistic perspective, I think Rozenstruik technically should have a lot of problems in this fight. I think that the wrestling of Curtis Blaydes, he's still the best wrestler in the division. I think that Rozenstruik doesn't defend takedowns too well. I think when he's put on his back, he can be a little bit stuck. If he does get back up to his feet in this fight, Curtis Blaydes is one of those fighters where he'll keep his arms locked around the body of his opponent to just look to drag them back down. And what that's going to do, and I think a takedown early in this fight is crucial for Curtis Blaydes. He can't wait like he did against Lewis, because ultimately I think in Blaydes' head he got a little bit frustrated the fact that he hasn't been able to shoot, and then he shot a lazy takedown with his head on the outside that allowed Lewis to time an uppercut and knock him out. But I think it's really crucial for Blaydes to shoot an early takedown in this fight, because if he can wear Rozenstruik out early in the fight, even if Rozenstruik survives and they go into round 2, Rozenstruik's going to be really hesitant to get anywhere close to Blaydes, because he won't want a repeat of that first round, at least in theory anyway. So I think from a stylistic perspective, Curtis Blaydes has every single advantage in this fight from where the fight should be won and lost, which should be in the wrestling and grappling department. Like I said, Blaydes has got to be careful that he doesn't get hit in this fight and knocked out. The one real concern you've got to have with Blaydes is Blaydes never really had a durability issue before, and I wouldn't necessarily say just because he's been knocked out by Derek Lewis that he's now got a durability issue. It's the punches after he was knocked out. Derek Lewis landed 2 or 3 devastating, big, unanswered blows, clean blows to the chin of Blaydes whilst Blaydes was already knocked out. That's my only concern here with Blaydes. Is he going to be the same fighter that he was prior to that fight, after those dangerous blows, after he was already knocked out? That's something that still remains to be seen. But I think if Blaydes just comes into this fight, doesn't even think about striking, looks to wrestle early, I think he should have a relatively comfortable night, because after that first takedown, once Rozenstruik is taken down, I think that Blaydes will be able to beat him up a little bit. I think if Rozenstruik gets back to his feet, Blaydes will just drag him back down. He'll just really wear him out, and the power will diminish a little bit from that first round. If Blaydes goes out there looking to try and strike with Rozenstruik, he's playing with fire, and you could be looking at a potential flip of the coin scenario. But Blaydes, generally speaking, is one of those fighters that you can trust in the UFC to go out there and to wrestle every single fight. I think that's what he does here, especially after coming off a knockout loss to Lewis. He won't want a repeat of that. That'll be his UFC championship dreams probably out the window. I think Blaydes is going to come to wrestle. I think he's going to be successful, and for those reasons I'm picking Curtis Blaydes to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jessica Andrade versus Cynthia Calvillo. Andrade is currently the -240 favourite. The comeback on Calvillo at +200 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, again, I think the value is slightly on the side of the favourite in Jessica Andrade, but the line is roughly where I'd expect it to be. I just think that if you are looking looking to bet the money line in this fight, I think Jessica Andrade at minus 240 is the better bet than Calvillo at plus 200. Now, as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, it's been an interesting one because Andrade was up at minus 275, minus 280. A lot of money's come back in on Calvillo, and actually I kind of agree with that money coming back in on Calvillo. I don't think Andrade should have been that big of a favourite, but I think where the betting line right now is where it's settled. I think it's where it's accurate and fair. So I don't think it's now going to fly off in either direction. When both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do expect the betting lines to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I can't help feeling that it's a really bad stylistic matchup for Cynthia Calvillo. I think Jessica Andrade is a fighter that's super aggressive. She's definitely going to be the better striker. She's going to throw more combinations. She's going to throw hard punches, more volume as well in this fight. I think if Calvillo tries to stand and strike with Andrade for 15 minutes, then she's just going to get beaten up, and there's a good chance that Andrade might finish her on the feet as well. So for Calvillo, she's got to be able to get a wrestling going and get her takedowns in, completed, so she can start grappling, which is where she's strongest. But I'm not necessarily convinced that she's a much better grappler than Jessica Andrade. Now, I do believe there's a bit of recency bias here in regards to talking about Andrade and a jiu-jitsu and a defensive grappling because of a last fight against Shevchenko, where a lot of people, and myself included, thought that it would be Andrade that would have the advantage in the wrestling and the grappling scenarios topside against Shevchenko. But Shevchenko flipped the script on that. She was the one that was out wrestling Andrade, taking her down, controlling her on the mat. And I think a lot of people have seen that from Shevchenko on Andrade and thought, okay, well, Calvillo's definitely going to be able to do that if Shevchenko could. Not saying that Calvillo's a better wrestler and a grappler than Shevchenko, but just seeing deficiencies in Andrade's game. But I don't see that being the case, if I'm being honest. I think that what we've got to keep reminding ourselves is just how good Valentina Shevchenko really is. So the fact that she was able to do that against Andrade isn't a deficiency in Andrade's game. It's just because Shevchenko's an absolute beast. I think in this fight, I'm not convinced that Calvillo's going to be able to take Andrade down. And if she does, I think Andrade's jiu-jitsu is good enough to remain safe and get back up to her feet. I think Andrade can make this fight ugly. I think Andrade could even shoot on Calvillo, take Calvillo down and do good work on top. Andrade is a beast when she's in top position. Sure, she's not quite as good off her back, but if she takes Calvillo down, yeah, Calvillo might be able to throw up an armbar or a triangle and look to sweep or reverse Andrade, but I just don't think it's going to be simple. I think Andrade has got enough advantages in enough areas in this fight. I think the wrestling and the grappling is relatively close. Maybe an edge to Andrade there, but I think the bigger moments in this fight are going to take place on the feet because I'm not sure Calvillo will be able to get a wrestling going. I think Andrade is going to land a ton of volume, a lot of powerful shots. I think she's got upside in regards to her finishing ability. I think she'll win the fight on the scorecard should it go 3 rounds. For those reasons, I'm picking Jessica Andrade to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got an interesting one in the bantamweight division. We've got Marlon Moraes versus Merab Dvalishvili. Dvalishvili is currently the minus 250 favourite. The comeback on Moraes at plus 210 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the money line, I do think at minus 250, that's where the betting line should be. I think it's accurate. I still think at minus 250 there's slight value on Dvalishvili's side, but Dvalishvili is also up at minus 275, minus 280 at some books, and I think that's slightly too wide. I think at that point the value is slightly on Moraes, but as I've already said, at minus 250 and minus 240 in some places as well, I think the value is on the side of Dvalishvili. Now, as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, this is one of the rare occasions where I've actually been wrong in regards to where the line moves, because I thought the betting lines would shorten up. I did think people would like Moraes as a 2-1 underdog, but that's not been the case. When the line does come down to around that minus 230 mark for Dvalishvili, all that money comes back in on him. So I'm actually a bit surprised by the movement in the betting line. I think that Dvalishvili will get bet up constantly to around that minus 270 mark. From there, he'll probably get bet back down to around that minus 230, minus 240. And I think we're going to see fluctuation like that. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I think Dvalishvili is going to be in that region of being between minus 240 and minus 270, minus 280. I think he's going to close at around minus 250 to -260. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I think if this fight is a kickboxing fight for 15 minutes, Marlon Moraes should be the favourite in this fight. I think he's going to be the better striker. I think he's got an edge in the striking. But this is a mixed martial arts fight, and although Dvalishvili has been testing his striking against other good strikers, overly testing it, even though we know where he's good in MMA, I think this is the step up that he needs to go back to his roots of where he's good, opposed to trying to match himself strike for strike with a fighter that's going to be the better striker, or at least a more dangerous striker. And I think Dvalishvili will know this. I think his team will know this. This isn't the fight to continue testing his striking. This is a big step up that he needs to win if he wants to boost himself up the rankings and start making a case against the best fighters in the division in that top 3 to 5. And I think that's what we see here. I think Dvalishvili will go relentlessly wrestling in this fight, as he's done in so many other previous fights. I think he will stand striking just to get his reads for maybe the first 30 to 60 seconds, and then he'll just put his foot on the gas pedal, put himself into 6th gear and start really pushing forward on Moraes. Now, actually, one of Dvalishvili's negative traits is going to help him in this fight, and what I mean by that is Dvalishvili struggles to keep fighters down on the mat once he's taken them down. His wrestling's phenomenal, his pace, his cardio is phenomenal, but the area where he struggles most is in his top side grappling. Now, that's actually not a bad thing in this fight, because Marlon Moraes has got a decent get-up game anyway. He's got a good jiu-jitsu himself. So it would be more concerning if Dvalishvili relied on top control time, because I just don't think he would get it in this fight. Where Dvalishvili wins fights is by not keeping his opponents down, them getting back up and him just rinse and repeating them. Now, judges don't tend to score very highly moments in fights where fighters are taking their opponents down and their opponents are standing back up. However, when the fighter's scoring 8, 9, 10, 11 plus takedowns in a fight, you can't ignore that. Also, those many takedowns breaks fights up from a striking perspective, so I don't think Moraes is going to be able to get into any sort of flow state or be able to get his game going enough to start really turning the fight in his favour. I think the constant takedowns from Dvalishvili are going to be constantly in his favour, breaking up that striking fluidity and ultimately just wearing Moraes down, whose gas tank is a little bit suspect, against Dvalishvili, who's got gas tank for absolute days. I think this is a favourable fight for Dvalishvili, as long as he doesn't do anything stupid and tries to stand and strike with Moraes for 15 minutes. I'd be really surprised if that happens. Aside from that, I think Dvalishvili is going to recognise this as a big step up in competition, a big opportunity for him to get a solid name on his record. I think he goes back to his roots. I think he relentlessly wrestles, and I think that's what wins him this fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Merab Dvalishvili to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight that might actually not happen. I'm going to break it down regardless, just in case it does. But we've got Dan Hooker versus Nasrat Haqparast. Now, before I talk about anything else, the reason that it's in the balance in regards to is it going to happen or not is Hooker had visa issues getting over to Vegas. He had to tweet out to the government, I think in New Zealand, to try and get something sorted, and he ended up getting it sorted. And he was flying out to Vegas Thursday, weighing in on Friday, which is really dangerous. At that point, I'm thinking, man, this is really bad for Hooker. Trying to cut weight on a plane is not the way to do it. And Nasrat Haqparast might actually knock him out if that's the case. But then a couple of days after that, Nasrat Haqparast came out on Twitter in Germany trying to tweet the German government, trying to get a visa over to Vegas as well. The exact same situation, wanting to fly out on Thursday, weigh in on Friday. So at this point, I'm not sure if Nasrat Haqparast has secured the visa. So that's why I'm unsure if the fight's actually going to happen or not. But it's just absolutely nuts we're in this scenario. I thought Nasrat will have been alright and it's from Hooker's side, but then when Nasrat came out with visa issues, I was just like, what's going on? It's crazy. But like I said, I will break the fight down just in case it does happen. Dan Hooker is currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Haqparast at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the favourite in Dan Hooker. I know a lot of people are really high on Haqparast here. I'm not ready to write Daniel Hooker off just yet. So at -145, I think if this was pre-Michael Chandler fight, Hooker would be north of -200. So that's where I see the value due to the recency bias. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, like I said, Haqparast is a popular bet. So I do expect this line to close up a little bit. I think a lot of people are going to be on Haqparast. But at the same time, on the flip side, I don't think there's going to be enough people on Haqparast to get anywhere close to flipping this line or bringing it down down to a pick'em. I think Dan Hooker's going to go into the fight roughly at around the -125 mark, with Haqparast at around +105, +110. Now, as for how this fight plays out, the obvious concern from Dan Hooker's perspective is his last fight with Chandler, where he was knocked out relatively easily. And then when you consider the wars that Hooker's had prior to that fight, you can start to build an argument to say that Hooker's been in a lot of wars. His durability isn't going to be what it used to be. He's not as fresh as what he used to be, and therefore he's going to have problems getting hit clean in the future. Now, like I say, you can build that argument, and I fully understand it. I'm just not ready to write Dan Hooker off just yet. I think Michael Chandler genuinely hits really hard. I think he's an explosive, dangerous fighter, and he's done that to a lot of opponents in his career as well. So I'm not ready to write Hooker off. I still think from a technical perspective, Hooker's a really good fighter. I think with Nasrat Haqparast has got to get inside and let go of the really hard combinations he throws, but sometimes he can take a little bit longer to get his reads in, like in the Joaquin Silva fight. Joaquin Silva did really well in that first round because I believe Nasrat Haqparast took that first round off pretty much to get his reads in. Now, Hooker's going to be really difficult, or much more difficult to read than a Joaquin Silva, so I do think if Haqparast is waiting around a little too much to get his reads in, he might be making a mistake, because at that point Hooker's just going to be letting his strikes go and firing away. I think from Haqparast's perspective, like I said, he's got to get inside and he's got to land something hard on Hooker, test that chin early, get that hesitancy in from Hooker early, and look to either try and finish him or take over the fight from that point. But like I said, I don't think Hooker's done just yet. I think from a technical perspective, this fight is likely going to be won and lost on the feet. Yes, we may see some wrestling, we may see some grappling, but I don't think that the moments in the wrestling and grappling, if they are there, are going to be significant enough to play a factor in how the fight is decided and who wins it. So I do think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think Hooker's going to land more volume. I think he's going to be more elusive. He's got more weapons in his arsenal. He's more varied in his attacks as well. And although Haqparast will have his moments, I think Hooker's just going to start racking up the volume. He's got much greater experience fighting, greater level of competition as well. So I think that's definitely going to play a factor in help him in this fight, because Haqparast, just, no disrespect, he's just not on the level of Michael Chandler, Dustin Poirier, Edson Barboza, Gilbert Burns. So I think Hooker is going to be able to manage this fight well, land volume, stay safe, and get the win. So for those reasons, I'm picking Dan Hooker to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight in the heavyweight division that should have happened twice already. It keeps getting pushed back. I broke it down once already, I will break it down again, but we've got Shamil Abdurakhimov versus Chris Daukaus. Chris Daukaus is currently the -210 favourite. The comeback on Abdurakhimov at +175 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think we're borderlining Daukaus becoming too big of a favourite at this point. I don't think we're a million miles off from Abdurakhimov being the value side, but at -210, I still kind of get why Daukaus is out there with that sort of betting line. And I do think that if you are going to play the money line of this fight, -210 is probably just the better bet than the +175 of Abdurakhimov. But if Daukaus comes up to -220, -225, then that value is definitely going to be on the side of the underdog. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, it's been moving already. Daukaus was a shorter favourite only a few days ago, so money's coming on him. I do think money continues to come on him. I think people put Daukaus in the same sort of category as Tom Aspinall in regards to being that young, good moving heavyweight that's knocking people out and landing volume and doesn't have cardio issues. So I think people will continue to bet Daukaus up to around that -225, -230 line, and I think that's where the betting line's going to close. Now, as for how this fight plays out, from Abdurakhimov's perspective, he's a tough competitor and he's a fighter that's fought in the UFC for years and has fought some really great fighters. I'm not seeing an obvious decline from him, but in regards to his skills, his abilities and his traits, he is more of a boxer. He can wrestle, obviously he does have that Russian wrestling background, but he is more of a boxer. He will look to stand and strike on the feet. His volume isn't great, but he will look for openings to let combinations go, which means that he's just a fighter that doesn't like to waste strikes, but a fighter that is happy to throw volume once he knows that there's a good chance of them landing. But I don't think his movement's that erratic. I don't think he's that quick. And this is where Daukaus comes in. I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. Daukaus has got decent takedown defense. So if Abdurakhimov does start trying to shoot takedowns, he might get one or two, but I just don't think they're going to come easily. They might not come at all. I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet in the striking department. I think Daukaus is going to be the faster fighter, the better moving fighter, the fighter that's likely going to land more volume. And I think what we might see from Abdurakhimov is him constantly waiting for those openings and those opportunities to land combinations himself. And if they start coming few and far between because of the movement of Daukaus, you'll just see Abdurakhimov being inactive for periods of this fight, which isn't going to look good on the judges' scorecards, and it's just going to allow Daukaus to grow into the fight. So I think Daukaus is going to impose his will on the striking. In the striking department, I think he's going to land more volume. I think he's going to land the more significant strikes. He's going to potentially have to defend some takedowns. I think he'll do okay there. I think he could potentially finish Abdurakhimov late, and if he doesn't, I do think he's going to be favoured on the scorecards as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Chris Daukaus to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Roxanne Modafferi against Taila Santos. Santos is currently the minus 370 favourite. They come back on Modafferi at plus 310 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the line's accurate. I do understand why Taila Santos is that wide at minus 370, although Modafferi is probably one of the most dangerous fighters to bet against when she's that big of an underdog. But I do agree with the betting line. I do understand it. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Taila Santos was up north of minus 400 just a few days ago, so some money is naturally coming back in on Modafferi, but I just don't think it's going to be enough money, consistent money, to really bring this line down and shorten it even further to say minus 330 or minus 320. I don't think it's going to get that low. If it does, people just parlay Santos and that'll widen the betting line back up again to where it's sitting right about now, which is also where I think that the betting line closes come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, honestly, I feel a little bit sorry for Modafferi with the way I analyse her fights, because upon reflection, it's almost like I never give her any chance of winning fights when, like I've just said in the introduction to this fight, you know, she's actually one of the most dangerous fighters to bet against when she's a big underdog, because she's pulled through so many times before. But honestly, I just say what I see, and I honestly think that she is very limited when it comes to certain level of opponents. So like with Taila Santos is a very fast-paced, aggressive fighter on the feet with a Muay Thai style. She's got good movement. She's in and out of range really well. She's fast, and I think that type of fight is going to give someone like Roxanne Modafferi nightmares, because Modafferi's movement is very limited. She's a little bit flat-footed at times, and she can be hittable because of that. So somebody like Taila Santos is going to have a lot of success in regards to the striking in this fight. Now, where Roxanne Modafferi needs to get this fight, just like a lot of other fights, is she needs to tie up with her opponent. She needs to score takedowns and get topside. But Taila Santos's takedown defense is getting better outside of that really dodgy UFC debut that she had, where I do think that debut jitters were a thing in that fight. She has looked good in regards to the wrestling. She's looked strong and physical in the clinch as well, especially in that Molly McCann fight where I thought McCann might have the physical advantages. Taila Santos is very strong in the clinch, so for Modafferi, she's going to have to use feint trip takedowns. She's not going to be able to really bully her opponent to the mat. So again, I just think stylistically, Santos is going to have a lot of advantages here. I think she's going to be able to keep the fight vertical. I think she might even be able to take Modafferi down if she wants to as well. But on the feet, I think she's going to be too fast, too powerful, and too explosive. And I think because Modafferi's hittable, that's going to give her even more issues as well. I think Taila Santos has got most bases covered in this fight wherever the fight goes. So for those reasons, I'm picking Taila Santos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Uros Medic versus Jalin Turner. Medic is currently the minus 127 favourite. They come back on Turner at plus 107 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the favourite in Medic at minus 127. 127. I think there is an argument that he could be potentially a bigger favourite, but on the flip side, I do understand why people like Turner at plus 107 as well. It's just for me personally, I see things in Medic as a fighter and his style that I really like, and I do think that he could make waves in the division going forward. So I think at minus 127, that's where the value side is. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, this has been fluctuating a lot. Medic has been at a minus 110 pick'em with Jalin Turner, but then all this money comes back in on Medic, pushes him up to minus 130, minus 135, and then it drops all the way back down to maybe minus 115, and then Medic is up at minus 125 again. So it seems there's a lot of fluctuations between the minus 110, minus 115 and up to around minus 130. So I do think that Medic is going to close roughly around that minus 125, minus 130 mark, with Jalin Turner being around plus 105, plus 110. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight. Jalin Turner is nearly always going to have the height and reach advantage over pretty much every opponent in the division because he's so physically big for the division. He's tall, he's long. But with Medic, although Jalin Turner is still going to have height and reach advantages, it's not going to be as significant in this fight because Medic is also a very tall and long fighter in the division. We've got 6'3" against 6'1", 2-inch difference in height, so that's barely going to even be recognizable. And I think from Medic's perspective, the only real concern that I have for him in this fight is what does he look like if this fight gets stretched into round 2 and into round 3. We don't know that he's going to be a gasser and he's not going to be able to go 3 rounds. We can't be too confident that he's going to look great over 2 or 3 rounds either, but what we have seen in round 1 is he does come out fast and hard, but he doesn't look like he particularly tires too much or slows down too much. So I've seen nothing, no real solid signs to say that he can't go 3 rounds. But on the flip side of that, with Turner, sure, Turner can go 3 rounds, but if you look at the record Turner has when fights go late, it's not a great record in itself. So even if you are thinking that Medic might not be able to go 3 hard rounds, I don't think Turner's that prolific going 3 rounds either. So I think that kind of nullifies itself. This fight, I believe, is going to be won and lost on the feet. If any fighter gets the wrestling going, it's more likely to be Turner, in my opinion. And I do think he's got good topside grappling. I do think Medic is a decent grappler though as well. He's got submissions off his back. And listen, a lot of people are going to discredit Medic and talk about how he's from Alaska FC, which is notoriously known for being one of the less competitive regional promotions in America, shall we say. So there is a lot of people discrediting what Medic has done, but I actually see good signs from Medic. I think he's very technical as a striker, even though he's aggressive and he pushes forwards. He's with a good team, a good coach, and a good camp with Master Rafael Cordero at King's MMA with the likes of Benil Dariush, Marvin Vittori, Giga Chikadze, you know, that list can go on. I think Medic is really aggressive. I think he's got a bit of a touch of death as well. Like, he seems to just hurt his opponents, whether he punches them or whether he kicks them or whether he launches into a flying knee. So I think that Medic is going to have a big finishing upside in this fight. Like I said, there are questions of if this fight goes late, what do both fighters look like at this point. But I don't think Jalin Turner pushes enough of a pace to really grind on Medic and maybe tire him as much as what another fighter would be able to do, just in case it goes 3 rounds. So I like Medic in this fight. I think he's going to land a ton of volume early. He's going to be aggressive. He's going to be explosive. He's going to be landing hard shots. I think that if he can bank 7.5 minutes in this fight, a good 7.5 minutes of volume, aggression and power, then he should be able to be up on the scorecards leading into the latter half of the fight. I think he's going to have 7.5 minutes in him of that style, of that pressure, with the aggression and along with the power. So it's for those reasons I'm picking Uros Medic to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Manon Fiorot versus Mayra Bueno Silva. Fiorot is currently the minus 235 favourite. The comeback on Silva at plus 195 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits slightly with Fiorot at minus 235. There is an argument, in my opinion, that she could be a bit of a wider favourite. I don't think too much wider, but I think the minus 235 betting line is the better bet than the plus 195 of Mayra Bueno Silva. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's actually going to ping off in either direction. I think if Manon Fiorot was a minus 185 favourite, then yes, you could see it pinging off to where it is now. On the flip side, I think if Manon Fiorot was a -350 favourite. You could see it shortening back up to roughly where it is now. So I actually think because the line's relatively accurately lined where it is, that it's not going to move too much. I think when the fight comes on Saturday night, the betting lines are going to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I actually like this fight a lot. I think there's going to be a lot of aggression from either side. I think Mayra Bueno Silva's actually going to start stronger in this fight with a strike, and I think she's going to get going a lot quicker than what Firo will. And I think at that point, people are going to think that this fight is going to be relatively close, but I think what's going to happen sort of maybe after the first half of the first round is that Firo's going to have her reads in. She's going to be able to start seeing things coming from Silva. She'll have done that initial read work so she can start to attack herself, and I just think that Firo's going to be more aggressive in this fight. Whichever fighter is on the back foot more is going to be the fighter that's going to struggle more and therefore potentially lose the fight, and I just see that being Mayra Bueno Silva. Firo doesn't like to take a backward step. She'll meet fire with fire if she has to. Now Silva will try and do that, but honestly I think the aggression and the power of Firo is going to end up being a little bit too much for Silva, which is going to force Silva on the back foot. I think Silva will start shooting takedowns as well, looking to get Firo down to the mat. I don't think that her wrestling's going to be overly successful in this fight, and if she does get Firo down, Firo's a decent grappler as well. I think she'll be able to stand back up to her feet. I just don't think Silva is going to be able to get enough of her game going through the larger portions of this fight, the more extended periods of this fight. I think that Manon Firo is going to have a lot of success for the majority of the fight, and that's what's going to not only allow her to have more of a finishing upside in this fight, but if the fight does go to the scorecards, I think she's just going to simply look better over the 3 rounds. So it's for those reasons I'm picking Manon Firo to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the newcomer Nicholas Maximov versus Karl Roberson. Maximov is currently the slight -115 favourite. The comeback on Roberson, the slight -105 underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, this style is a very split style. It's a good matchup, so the fact that the betting lines are so close, if you've got a good read on this fight, then either side is playable as long as you do have that good read. If you are going to push me for a value side, I would say the value is slightly on Nicholas Maximov at -115. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Maximov was a plus money underdog for the majority of the time that this betting line was released. It was only over the last couple of days we've seen a lot of money coming on him. That trend I do kind of agree with. It's pushed it into a pick'em, and then Maximov now into a very slight favourite spot, and ultimately I do see a bit of money coming back in on Roberson as well. I think when these two fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, it is going to be a dead even -110 pick'em on either side. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I said in the introduction to this fight that it's a split clash of styles between both fighters, and it's a very obvious striker versus grappler matchup. You've got Karl Roberson with the kickboxing background. Admittedly, he does have and has developed his wrestling and grappling quite well in the UFC, but ultimately, when he comes against especially somebody that's been wrestling and grappling for the majority of their life, that's where he comes a little unstuck, and that's where we've got Nick Maximov here, because Maximov was a college wrestler. He is now a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, training at the Nick Diaz Academy, so you know he's got good grappling in him. He also competes in grappling bouts, grappling tournaments. He was in Submission Underground 25 in his last competitive appearance, and he was fighting or grappling a guy called Gustavo Pires, who was a 4th degree Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. And sure, Maximov got beat, but he was competitive and he scored takedowns in that bout as well. So listen, Maximov's good. He's a good grappler, and I think if he gets this fight to the mat, I do think early on Roberson's going to be able to get back up to his feet, but Maximov is just relentless. If the fight stands back up, it won't be long before he's diving back at the ankles, trying to ankle pick his opponent and take them back down again. That is one thing you can trust from Maximov, that he will be constantly trying to ground his opponent. So I think Roberson does a good job early on of getting back up to his feet, but I think the relentless wrestling and the pressure that Maximov will put on him will just allow the rinse and repeat wrestling, and the more that Maximov takes him down, the less likely it is that Roberson's going to get back up to his feet each time, and I just think Maximov drowns him like that. The one thing that Maximov's got to be careful of is he doesn't shoot a sloppy takedown, and he doesn't wait too long to try and take Roberson down as well, because Roberson's striking is absolutely levels above Maximov. If this fight does have extended periods of time on the feet in that kickboxing range, then Roberson's going to absolutely light Maximov up. I just don't think Maximov will allow it, and that's why I'm favouring Maximov to win. I think he's going to score the takedowns he needs. He won't be as successful early as what he will be later in the fight, but I do think he eventually just becomes too heavy in regards to the relentless wrestling and the top pressure, and I think he's going to wear Roberson out. He might get a finish along the way, but if he doesn't, he should be able to suffocate him over 3 rounds. I'm picking Nicholas Maximov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Matthew Semelsberger versus Martin Sano. Semelsberger is the minus 485 favourite. The comeback on Sano at plus 385 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, even though the line is really wide, and I was surprised to see a minus 485 number next to Matthew Semelsberger's name before I looked into tape. After tape, I definitely understand why it's that wide, and I actually think that the minus 485 betting line is the better bet, obviously in a parlay opposed to playing straight, than the plus 385 on Sano's line. So that's where I see the value. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I only think this line is going to grow. You can see in some other books it's at minus 500, minus 520. I think that's more accurate than where it is at minus 485. I do think we might see Semelsberger up closer to minus 550, minus 600 come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I hope this really doesn't come across as disrespectful. I don't mean it to, but I've got no idea how Martin Sano has been signed by the UFC. In his last 3 fights, he's 0-2-1. So he drew his last fight. He lost the 2 before that. The 2 losses were to Dominic Waters in 2014, then Don Muhammad in 2016, and then he drew against Diego Herzog in 2017. So the dude hasn't even been active either. Now that can sometimes mean that you might see developments in his game coming into this fight. If he's not fought for so long, then he's had a lot of time to work on things, but he's not exactly a spring chicken. He's 30 years old, so he's in his prime. This is where he should be fighting 3 or 4 times a year. So like I say, I'm a bit confused to why Martin Sano has been signed to the UFC. Also, watching his tape as well, he doesn't look like a spectacular fighter. He's very much a striker. He looks to come forwards, aggressive, throwing big punches, but his cardio suffers because of that. He can be taken down relatively easily. He can be controlled as well. So I just really don't see too many solid paths to victory against Semelsberger, who is also a good striker. He can put power behind his strikes. He can land in combinations. His pace is frenetic. He can really push a good pace, and he's got a good cardio to back that up as well. But he's also got decent wrestling and decent top control in regards to when you're comparing him to Sano. So I think wherever this fight goes, Semelsberger's simply going to be better. I think he's the better striker. I think he's the better wrestler, the better grappler, the fighter with the better cardio as well. So I don't see too much of a path to victory for Sano outside of potentially a puncher's chance that just shocks everyone and he knocks Semelsberger out. So it's for those reasons I'm picking Matthew Semelsberger to win this fight. And in the final fight of the breakdown, and in the first fight of the night, I've no idea why this is the first fight of the night, we've got Omar Morales versus Jonathan Pierce. Morales is currently the minus 150 favourite. The comeback on Pierce at plus 130 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think the value sits with the underdog in Jonathan Pierce. I actually really like both fighters. I think it's going to be a phenomenal fight, really exciting, a good watch. But I do feel that the line is slightly too wide, and I think Pierce at minus 130 is the value side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to close up. Normally, if this was 12 months ago, I'd be saying Omar Morales will get bet up to minus 200. But right now, I actually think that the betting line will shorten. It will close up. Not too much. I don't think it'll hit a pick'em. But I could see Omar Morales coming into this fight roughly around minus 130, with Pierce sitting around plus 110 as the underdog. Now, as for how this fight plays out, like I said, I really like both fighters. I think it's going to be an exciting, explosive fight. Both fighters love to be aggressive, come forwards and throw hard strikes. I think Omar Morales is more technical and more cleaner and crisper with his striking, whereas Jonathan Pierce is more wild, more aggressive. He'll come forward and look slightly more exciting doing so. So for Omar Morales, if he's smart in this fight, he would try and drag Jonathan Pierce into these wild exchanges. And whilst Pierce is coming forward, wild, aggressive, Omar Morales could potentially just take a step back, get his reads in and start countering to that aggression that Pierce is coming in with. But the thing is, I'm just not convinced Omar Morales is as efficient as what I once thought that he was. So I was really high on Omar Moraes. I liked him against Giga Chikadze. I liked him against Shane Young. And listen, the loss to Giga Chikadze is fair enough. Giga Chikadze's shown that he's going to be competing up there with the best in the division. But the Shane Young fight was the one that really made me nervous. And the reason being is I bet Omar Moraes quite heavily in that fight, expecting him to just absolutely run through Shane Young, because the pre-fight analysis just showed so many advantages for Omar Moraes. But actually watching that fight, sure, Omar Moraes did end up winning relatively comfortably on the scorecards, but Shane Young was in every single round, absolutely. And that's a concern here, because I do think that Jonathan Pearce is a much tougher matchup than Shane Young. So I think Pearce is going to be able to steal rounds here. He might only be able to steal one and lose the fight, but would it shock me if he stole 2 rounds and won 29-28? It wouldn't, because of the style that Pearce fights in. He's aggressive, he comes forward, he's wild. The judges want to see fighters looking to finish fights. But Pearce has also got wrestling behind him as well. Now, I don't think Moraes is going to be easy to take down. If he is taken down, I don't think Pearce is going to completely run through him and overcrowd him on the mat, but I just feel that Pearce has got those abilities to really break this fight up should he need to. And if he's the one looking aggressive, coming forwards, looking like he's trying to win the fight and finish the fight, but then he's also landing sporadic takedowns and having 20 to 30 seconds on top of Moraes, those things are going to add up if the fight hits the scorecards. I do think that Moraes might have the upside in the finishing ability in this fight. I think he might be the fighter more likely to finish than Jonathan Pearce, but I don't think there's a massive edge there. And I think over 3 rounds, Pearce could outvolume Moraes. Moraes can wait around a little bit too much at times. So I think Pearce can be the more active fighter, be the more aggressive fighter, and mix things up with the takedowns as well. And it's for those reasons I'm picking Jonathan Pearce to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it. And as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. If I've ever helped you win a bet and win some money with my analysis and predictions, then please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel as well. All our subscriptions are at very affordable prices. Just hop onto MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.